Hey guys, welcome back. BDCKR here. We're back with Season 9, Episode 21 of our weekly Q&A videos / podcast. I guess I should just say episode.
Yeah.
It's what is it? It's not a video, it's not a podcast, it's just content.
We are the kings of all media.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
It's just media.
And so if you're on YouTube, links in the description to get this on a lot of different podcasting platforms. And if you're on a podcasting platform right now, good for you. Congratulations.
That was a riff on Howard Stern in case nobody noticed. Because he used to call himself king of all media, but he basically did the same shtick across all media. So he had his radio show, so he was highly ranked in that. He made a movie about his life getting onto radio.
Yeah.
That was highly ranked, so he called himself the king of movies for that. And then he took the radio show and televised it and broadcast that over TV. So then that was him being
triple threat,
a TV star. Yeah, basically repurposing the same content, which is what we're doing.
So there we go. Our first question this week comes from Fabrobin,
who was a source
impossible to know
all our questions and conversational takeoff points last week.
Yeah, there's no way to know how it's pronounced. It's impossible to find out. And there'd be no way for us to access that information, even if if it is out there, if such a thing exists as a correct way of pronouncing a name.
Yeah.
And they say, I was surprised to hear you guys bring up that research on self-fulfilling prophecy. Is one of you a psychology major in university? I'm always impressed by how wide your range of knowledge is. And so, to answer that question very easily and simply, yes, one of us is a psychology major in university. And the second piece of information is that it's me.
It's me.
And so we can talk a little bit about this. So
it's me, Mario.
One of the interesting things, right, is you go into programs to learn about that topic, right?
Right.
And I think in general, you expect to come out knowing more than you went in with. Right. And I think sometimes I actually even do the listeners of this channel a bit of a disservice when I talk about psychology research. Because one of my biggest takeaways from the psychology research that I've done, my psychology undergraduate, and this, I need to preface this to say that I'm not anti-science at all, but it's how garbage a lot of research is, and how really hard it is to take research and make big claims with it.
Okay, so sorry, are you talking about research, general research, or you're talking about specifically psychology research?
I'm talking about, so my field is in psychology, right? My sort of main wheelhouse. So I'm talking about psychology research, but one of the things that I learned, so one big thing in psychology specifically was something called the replication crisis, right? Which is this idea that people went back and they tried to copy studies exactly and see how the results shook out. And they found that a lot of studies didn't replicate. And there's a bunch of reasons for it. There's a big explanation, and a lot of it's very technical, so I think a lot of it's not worth getting into. But basically, there is this number called the alpha, or the p-value, and it tends to be set to 0.05.
So that p-value, 0.05, is really like a representation percentage.
Yeah.
So there's a 5% or 1 in 20 chance that the differences you're seeing as a result of your intervention in that sample size that you picked is due to random chance and not because there's actually a real difference when you make that intervention.
Close, but that's not even exactly it.
All right.
So that's one of the things, is that the vast majority of people, including psychologists and including psychology researchers, kind of slightly misunderstand what that even means. And that is when you are collecting your data, right? You're usually finding some point of comparison. You're usually saying we expect this, and we're getting something different. So maybe you expect, like, men and women to score the same on a test, and then you see that they have a difference in score. And so what a null hypothesis is basically what you would expect if there's nothing interesting going on underneath the hood, if it's basically business as usual. So a null hypothesis.
So maybe it's the way we're using intervention, because what you're describing is a case where it's not so much that it's intervention, it's one descriptor.
Yeah.
It's like one thing that it makes no difference. And that when there's an observed difference, it's just a variation of normal.
Yeah.
The null hypothesis is still true.
But so that's when the p-value is set to 0.05, what that actually is if you assume that the null hypothesis is true.
Yeah.
What's the chance that you would get a result that's this far off of the null hypothesis? And that actually matters a lot. Right. And so there's a lot of things. Again, I don't want to make this a really sort of dry psychology education thing, but they found that a significant percentage of researchers, statistics professors, psychology professors would actually believe one or more incorrect things about what the p-value actually meant. That the vast majority of people, for example, didn't use the correct statistical techniques and tools because a lot of them have things that need to be true. They have prerequisites for you to be able to apply that statistical technique. And a lot of times those are violated. And again, I don't want to get into it. I don't want to be super technical. They analyzed a bunch of papers, and there's a lot of math that you can't check without the raw data, but there are some pieces of math where there's enough information in the paper that you can confirm if something is done right. And they found that in something like 80% of papers, there was at least one mistake just in the numbers that you could actually verify without even having access to the raw data. Right. So, and none of this is to say that it's all bad, that it's all bunk, right? But there's been a lot of stuff to throw doubt. And again, this is within psychology, but the, textbooks and papers and discussions on it that I read, right? We're talking about how a lot of other fields have very similar methodology with their research, and how psychology is one of the places in which there tends to be a lot less vested interest and external pressure to not go back and critique something, right? Where so there's the same problem with low sample size. There's the same problem with inappropriate statistical
Sorry, I
techniques.
didn't follow that last sentence. There's
Didn't make sense to you?
Yeah, there's a lot of sort of...
So psychology as in the scientific disciplines is one that has a lot more of an emphasis on criticism and going back and analyzing results and having other people come to it. It is.
See, okay, so this is, if that's what you're saying, that's interesting to me, because it feels like until very recently, until very maybe like, let's say last 10 years, it's the opposite has been true, where somebody would do something, they would come to an interesting conclusion, and people wouldn't go back and interrogate that and try to reproduce it and criticize it if they weren't able to reproduce it. It feels like when they come to a really interesting sort of pop psychology conclusion, it just sits and it stays there for like years. That's
the question is so pop psychology conclusions. It depends on how much you're doing with it, whether it sort of sits by itself as like an interesting fact, or whether it spawns a field of research and people sort of go into it more, right? But this is just to say that there's also a lot of information to suggest that certain, trials for medications and stuff in like biology and other fields has similar issues. So one of the this is sort of a psych and biology combination, but there was a series of studies done on oxytocin, and the way that they were being tested was nasal administration.
Okay.
And what came to light, so there was a bunch of studies that actually found results. They found that oxytocin, and that's supposed to be a hormone that is centered around like building connections with people and building relationships. And they found...
And releasing breast milk.
Yeah. And what they found later was that when the science got more firmed up, they discovered that a nasal spray as a route of administration could not deliver any significant amount of oxytocin to the bloodstream, so that it practically was doing nothing. It was just like essentially a placebo. And there was still this research that found results. And there's a bunch of reasons why this happens. Again, it's a big thing. Like, it's a really big problem. There's been a huge amount of discussion, but what the bottom line is that people make a lot of mistakes. People do stuff without really understanding what it means a lot of the time.
But it shouldn't matter. Like, if we're taking that specific example, then even if your underlying assumption is wrong, that your intervention even has a chance of making a difference because you're not absorbing it into the bloodstream, then the results should either show a difference or no difference.
Yeah.
And if you're comparing it to a control group, and it's randomized, and it's placebo, and the size of your sample is big enough, then you'll end up saying, oh, so inhaling nasal spray oxytocin will make no difference.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So, and it's also possible then that there's an interaction that happens at a level that it does not involve serum levels. That you could have, if there is a difference,
mm-hmm.
maybe it has to do with the nasal mucosa, and that there's something, maybe it's going to be the olfactory nerve that triggers something to the brain.
Yeah, and so here's the thing though, when you go back and look at the research, it was really small sample sizes. There was a bunch more studies that were being done and not published. And part of the thing is that if you're assuming that P level of 0.05, right, that's a 5%, 1 in 20 times, you're going to find a result that hits that threshold just by chance, even if there is no relationship. Right. And so there's all of these other factors that make it essentially significantly more likely. One of these things is called like p-hacking, where you mess around with how you analyze the data and other stuff, how you move outliers. And there was like another study where they had like a huge number of teams analyze the same data set, and they found that there was not a majority consensus on whether or not the results were significant. There was like different camps that found different results analyzing the same data set, just using different statistical methodology and
I feel
analysis
like
techniques.
Yeah, but shouldn't that matter a lot less if you're... I mean, the next... Really what you should be doing is using larger sample sizes, like rehashing the same data for a small sample where maybe you don't get all the raw data or you've got other stuff that's going on.
Yeah.
It feels a lot like navel gazing. Instead of taking a broader look and getting more people involved, maybe having a much more robust observation.
Yeah.
Because you're just looking at so many more people. Or maybe you'll take that and it'll wash it out because that was a small sample size and it was meaningless.
Yeah, and that's what you should do, but that's not what happens, right? So one of the things is that you have to look at the ways that the incentive structures are set up for publishing and replication studies, and doing the same thing but with a larger sample size don't tend to get funding and they don't tend to get published. And so there's an incentive to do something new, be the first one to do it.
Okay, but isn't that what we were saying? Isn't that what I just said earlier about how it doesn't seem like there was a lot of motivation to go back and do those same studies?
Yeah, and so what's happened now there's a lot more of a push to do that. But the important bit is that all of that, what we're also talking about here, is the process of science in the abstract, right? This is what you should be doing. What we know right now is that a lot of studies don't replicate. A lot of them are using stats wrong. A lot of them are, there's all of these issues. And that's the issue when you talk about science, is because when I'm talking about science and research, I'm not talking about the entire field. I'm not talking about an overview of all of the sort of balance of one side and the other, and the follow-ups with larger samples and stuff. When I have access to that information, maybe that'll inform what I'm saying. But when you tell somebody about science and a topic, most often what you're telling them about is individual research studies, which you have not crunched the numbers on yourself, which sometimes you've read all the way through and done a critical analysis, but a lot of times you haven't. And so here's basically the bottom line of what I'm trying to say for this, is that it's oftentimes a lot more complicated. There's a lot of room for error. And the best, and one of the only ways I think you can really confidently speak to a piece of research, is if you've read it in its entirety, the paper in its entirety, and understood it yourself. Because even when the research is good, there's a caveat of the way that the author has interpreted it, which isn't always fair, and isn't always the same conclusion that you would have come to when you look past what feels like it should be objective, the data. So like another thing is that there was this autism study, and the researchers were looking at empathy, and they were expecting the autistic people to score lower on these empathy scales. Mm-hmm. Their hypothesis was basically that they would score lower on them, and that would show that, it was a deficit in autism. And then they found that for the scales that they were using, that the autistic people were actually scoring higher on the empathy scales. And then they sort of reinterpreted...
They jiggered the scale so that it would score differently?
No, they didn't do that. They just, in their conclusion, they just reinterpreted it to say that the higher empathy was like non-adaptive or whatever, and that it was still an evidence of the deficit of autism.
So, but then what they're saying is that the scale that they picked wasn't a good one. That's all it really is. They can't come to another conclusion.
Well, it could mean one of many things.
No, but that's what you're describing then is if they're saying that it didn't, then the scale that they chose as the measure didn't actually work. For them to come to a different conclusion, it would require them to say that the scale wasn't good because the scale's telling them otherwise.
No, but they were saying that the higher score on the empathy scale was actually still indicative of a deficit, not a deficit in empathy. I forget exactly how they framed it, but it was that it was still an issue, that it was a problem that they were scoring higher on this empathy scale, that they were like over empathetic and like in a somehow wrong way compared to neurotypical people.
Right, but so this is the issue, right? Because if you want it to be more than just a qualitative study, they pick those things, right? Like whether it's like a pain scale or an empathy scale or a depression score or whatever, you're looking for an objective, reproducible way. If they're taking the information they're getting from that and rejecting it outright, so the conclusion directly from that should be their empathy is higher.
Yeah.
They've got more empathy.
Yeah.
And they reject that conclusion. It's a criticism of the scale. Like, because they've got their preconceived notions of what there is. They're using their own judgment of what they're seeing in their sample size to say, hey, our conclusion's still right. This scale we picked is wrong.
Yeah, but so the interesting thing is they're not saying that the scale is wrong. They're just reinterpreting the results to support their original
Right. They may not be explicitly saying the scale is wrong. In order to come to a different conclusion and to reject the findings of that scale, the objective number that they get from that, that's what they're literally doing, even if they're not saying it.
But they're not saying that they're lower in empathy. They're just reinterpreting it to say that it's a weird version of empathy. Basically, the main conclusion, it turns out that the main piece of information they were coming into it and the main assumption they were making was that it's better to be neurotypical than autistic. And they were just restructuring the results to say, well, the score that the neurotypical people got was the one that's good. And that doesn't have to be a rejection of the scale. It's just well, it does if the scale is the higher is better. Like, unless they say that there's some score in the middle, like it's not like. But BMI. They weren't saying that higher was better. That's what I'm saying. They scored higher. I don't.
There's more empathy. Like they're saying, separate from function. So here's an example. So
but are you assuming that more empathy is better?
No, I'm saying that their original point was that there was a deficit of empathy.
Their original hypothesis, not their original point.
Or the original hypothesis. Yeah. So but that's the point they're sticking to. That there's a deficit of something functional, and this thing that they've measured called empathy with this particular scale. They're rejecting.
No, but they're not saying that it's a deficit of something functional. They're saying that having autism is a deficit based off of the scores. They're not saying that there's a deficit in a quantifiable thing. It's not that...
But that is the quantifiable. The fact that they chose a scale, they're trying to make something qualitative quantifiable.
Yeah.
Like, so some things, for example, like blood pressure, it's supposed to be a J curve morbidity, so that there's a number that's sort of ideal. Too low is bad, and you're going to die.
And then too high is also bad.
I think BMI is supposed to be like that too, but not accurately so. Like, not really, but a really high BMI is bad, but so is a really low BMI. So but that's a specific kind of idea that there's a J curve. So if they're not going with that, like if they're just taking this measurement and they're using the scale and they're generating numbers with it, then in order to come to a different conclusion, they have to take something that they've assumed at the beginning and thrown it out the window. Like, it's still, like, it doesn't really make sense to me.
Yeah, there's just not an internal consistency of the way it's being interpreted. And that's what I'm saying, right? If you actually read the paper, if you look at the abstract, you go, okay, well, this is what the results are. And then when you read the paper, I think you're trying to sort of force a level of logic on the paper itself, where that's sort of my point, is that it doesn't make a lot of sense. And there's a lot of research, published research, that when you really dig into it, it doesn't make a lot of sense. And there's a point where your sort of personal understanding of it breaks down a little bit. Right? And so...
All I can say is this is not injustice.
This is not injustice at all. So maybe we'll move on. But my point is that individual studies are not as reliable as you think they are. And a lot of the way that we talk about science, and even the way that I
and we
talk
say
about
you
science,
mean like people in general, not like us having this specific conversation.
People in general, and it was me, and it still is me. I think when when I talk about research, I have that tendency to talk about individual studies and results like it's information that people have figured out and it's fixed. And so it's really hard to talk about science. And the other thing that it sort of made me realize, which I think is a lot more positive, which is that science, when you have a big sample size, right? People like to talk about how an individual person's experience is not research, right? It's just a single example.
Well, sort of, I mean, technically, it's not high-level research, but anecdote is a low-level research. What you're doing is case studies.
And there's a lot of people who will be dismissive of a group of people talking about their own personal experiences and they'll go like, oh, well, like, where's the research, right? Where there's a group of people will come and talk to you about something. They'll say, here's an issue that we have. And they go, I don't see any studies, right?
But that's a starting point. That's how you start studies, when you have individual cases that seem interesting. And that's a motivation to look at larger sample sizes and see if that is actually something reproducible. Yeah,
and so the kind of positive thing that I've realized is that if you have a group of people, and they don't even need to be the biggest group of people, but if you have a lot of people all coming forward and saying, here's an issue that I have, in a lot of cases, that's about as good as the research that's out there. So I think it's one of my biggest takeaways from studying psychology is devaluing a little bit individual pieces of research and sort of having a better understanding of the value of groups of people talking about their own lived experiences. And obviously, when people talk, there's not a comparison point. People have lived one life, they've only had their own personal experiences. But a big group of people coming forward and telling you something, in a lot of cases is going to be pretty comparable with a lot of the research that's out there, unfortunately.
Yeah. I see. I guess I'm struggling a little bit with that because I think maybe I'm coming at it from a non-psychology point of view. I think there's different problems with other kinds of research. There's a Twitter sort of response that I like, which is, I can't remember what the account's called, but the name is something like "in mice." Yeah. So the level that I see when we're talking about, say, pharmacological interventions, I think that kind of study is more important because it's the nature of what you're studying. Yeah. But the bigger failure in that kind of research is that they don't wait for human studies at a higher level to get excited, and that there's the motivation in that kind of sort of pop science is to push any interesting idea, no matter what stage you are at for having something useful. Yeah, they'll be like they cured cancer in mice. Right. By doing something that would almost certainly not be possible to do in humans. Right. Didn't they there was something weird where they cured cancer by giving mice HIV? I don't know. Or something like that. There's just so much going on. It's like when anybody has some sort of new concept, this is why you have trouble with paradigm shifts, is because everybody wants to be the one that makes that shift and to present something. But there's so many thousands of ideas. Most of them are crap, which is why when there is something that is really new, it is so astonishing and earth-shattering and big, because there's literally thousands of ideas that end up in the garbage because they are garbage. Yeah. So there we go. That was a big old discussion about research and psychology. Yeah. But our first injustice question comes from Cameron107. They say, I could be wrong, but as far as injustice is concerned, the idea of having lower promotion characters to improve matchmaking actually started with you guys when you showcased your Elite 5 Flashpoint team. I don't think I saw anyone in the community try something like that before you two. I don't know if this is what inspired the Scopos build, but the idea has definitely existed before. This is talking about the Unbalanced Scopos build from a previous Q&A. And they say, what I find interesting, though, is that fighting game developers in general have tried to avoid these kinds of strategies existing in their games since the late 90s. I don't know if you guys have heard of the King of Fighters games, but they were the first to introduce the 3v3 team format that most fighting games follow today.
Well, in King of Fighters 99, they introduced a new model where you could choose anywhere from 1 to 4 characters in a team, and the game would balance your team's power level accordingly. But this turned out to be a nightmare from a game design perspective, and they had to reverse their decision the next year. The only teams that were viable were single character teams, because in a 1v4 match, the game would make one character as strong as the other 4 to balance it out. So you would just solo through all the offline content of the game with one character, and online was a mess because teams didn't even exist. Fighting games in general have tried to avoid this sort of thing like the plague ever since. Injustice Mobile is honestly the only relatively new game I can think of that lets you cheese the matchmaking system in a similar way. And the Scopos build reminds me so much of King of Fighters 99 because it's basically a single character team, but with 2 teammates that might as well not exist outside their passives. So this is really cool. I really like this comment.
And it makes me think of a bunch of different things, actually. One is, it's not just fighting games. So if you look at Pokemon,
yeah,
one of the things that they do to avoid this is that, and actually in Injustice 2 and in a lot of games, is that the amount of progress that you need to make,
mm-hmm.
so the amount of experience you need to make progress
mm-hmm.
increases hugely. So it's harder for you to have an unbalanced team where at any given level in the game,
mm-hmm.
you can accumulate so much experience and power in one character that you can steamroll over everybody.
Mm-hmm.
So for the experience that you're wasting on one character, you could be developing a team that's overall much better.
Yeah.
That's the first thing. So it's not just fighting games. But the second thing I think is that it seemed like, and this is one of those times where maybe a study would be good,
mm-hmm.
and not just our anecdata, but it felt like that the matchmaking used to be that the other team would be matched against the strongest character on your team.
Mm-hmm.
And it really felt like that because I know that this isn't the first time we've tried anything like this where there's an unbalanced team. But unbalanced teams used to be much more difficult to fight with. Because it could be a 1 versus 4 fight, but your 1 would be no stronger than any of the 4 characters on the opponent's team, and you'd be, really 1 versus 3. And your other 2 slots would be sort of...
Duds,
yeah. Like you'd really need to be good with your 1 character
mm-hmm.
to make a go of it.
Yeah, but so I think the point about fighting games is really interesting because matchmaking is such a challenging thing. I mean, part of, that's a lot of games. So I've been playing some Valorant recently, right? Mm-hmm. And they use what's called an MMR, a matchmaking rating, for determining who you get put up against. And it's a real sort of pull, right? To try to figure out how to balance people. And so this 1 versus 4 thing is talking more on the pure objective back-end stats level, right? Of if you have a team of 1, it's just stronger than the same team, or than somebody at the same skill level playing another team of 4. But when you're playing in online, the other thing that you have to consider is how are you matching those 2 people, right? Are they the same skill level? And I think that that's kind of, in competitive multiplayer games, I think that's actually like the biggest thing, is figuring out how you put people up. Because when you go into a game and you click online and you try to play a game, the question is, how do you make it so that, because in an ideal world, you put people up against 2 teams, same skill up against each other. You're going to win about 50% of the time, lose about 50% of the time.
Right.
Right? That's perfect. It's exactly 50-50 shot of winning or losing. But the other thing is within that, you also want to make games fun and close, right? And I think every single competitive multiplayer game has struggled since day 1 to try to figure out the best way to match people up so that games can be close, interesting, and fun. So I think that's one of the biggest things.
So maybe there needs to be a correction in matchmaking because, so here's the thing. So let's say, for the sake of argument, that passes are pretty similar, the skill level is pretty similar,
mm-hmm.
and that you don't take gear scores into account because you want to still motivate people
mm-hmm.
to get better gears, because that would be kind of crappy. If the better gears just meant your fights were harder, you'd get no advantage, you'd be spending a bunch of time getting stuff
mm-hmm.
that would be useless except on offline fighting.
Mm-hmm.
So you know how you do it. If you've got somebody who's Elite 7, say level 40, like a team of 3 of them, then you'd match them against. So each incremental level up counts against you more. Like it counts, not counts against you more, but adds way more to your score. So that you're less likely to be able to have one guy on your team and junk, and have that one guy so far outclass the other one that you can totally steamroll the other team. And I think that's the fact that you're seeing any kind of success with a really unbalanced team means that that's not happening.
That's true. And I mean, I think part of it too is that it's hard when you're balancing an injustice. I think they're fundamentally balancing for a different thing, because it always is you playing versus the AI, right? It's essentially an offline mode where you're being matched up against
a team composition. You're not matched up against a strategy. You're matched up against the pre-fight strategy, which is the team composition.
It's a passive online mode, and it's one where you can consistently win, right? I think their motivation is not to make it balanced, because there's not a person on the other side who can be frustrated if they lose. So I don't even know, you know, if I'm trying to think like an Injustice developer, what their actual goal is, right? I think their goal is to make the fights as fun for you. And I think fights tend to be more fun when you win them, right? So if I was the Injustice developer, I wouldn't even necessarily want to match stuff up based off of, you know, power level. I think that's one of the pieces of information that you have to account for. But I think just doing power level alone, I mean, we can see that there's like teams with a lot better synergy, and there's always going to be hidden stats that are almost impossible to calculate. I don't even know how I'd go about doing sort of a balanced matchmaking system if my goal was fun.
Yeah, I would look at I'd have to look at some of the passives too, because there's certain passives that are just good no matter what you do, and certain passives are good if you play them a certain way.
Yeah.
I think, if anything, I would want to punish the teams where you sort of arbitrarily drop whoever in. And if there's a specific strategy to it, then they need to be able to benefit from it, so that there's sort of a big swing between playing it badly means the team is awful, playing it well means this team is great. Those are the best kind of teams that you want to reward, and make it so that they actually encourage people to be thinking while they're playing the game, and thinking when they're planning how to set it up.
But then how do you even reward that? Do you reward
by scoring them a certain way? So let's say,
giving them more battle points, or
no, I would reward them by saying that the matchmaking means that. So let's say, I guess if you think there's a range for how good they are, so the starting point to me would be stats. And if there's a range for how good this team would be, find an objective way to measure it. Score it according to a bad way of playing it and a good way of playing it.
Yeah.
And then set it up so let's say, for example, you've got a Batman Ninja team.
Yeah.
And Catwoman's in first slot. And you've got 2 Batman Ninja teammates in reserve.
Yeah.
I would score that team a little bit higher than a team that had Batman Ninja Catwoman in reserve.
Yeah.
Because her teammates could get knocked out before she actually comes in, and they won't be able to save her. Although that's the flip side
complicated.
So maybe the problem then is
when you say score them higher, what's the actual matchmaking? Are you matching it against easier teams, harder teams?
No, I'm matching them against equal teams as a starting point. So then it still escalates after that, because it makes it harder to finish your ultimate ladder. Although, you know, that's maybe not the greatest example, because
so then I still don't understand, how are you rewarding them?
What you're rewarding them by not making their fights harder. So if there's a way that you can score them, like I guess if you're gonna do like what's that score called? That was in Injustice 2.
Threat level.
That it's not one fixed threat level. It's a range.
So, okay, but I literally don't understand. So when you say not making their fights harder, you're saying making their fights not scale up as you go through the ladder? No. Or are you saying making their fights
you're
easier,
matching them against either the average or something below average. So if there's certain teams...
So you're saying making the fights easier?
No. There's certain teams that have less of a range. Doesn't matter which order you tag them in, which order they come in on the team. And the Catwoman example is probably not a great one, because her passive actually benefits her from tagging in. So scratch that, something else. But that there's certain ways to, if you want to assess a team, that you put them up against somebody who's not at the top of the scale against them.
Yeah.
But right in the middle of the range.
Yeah.
So that way, when you play them better, you have an advantage. And then when you play them poorly, it'll feel like you're really struggling against them.
Mm. And so you're saying that a team that is sort of doesn't matter how you play them as much is going to be fighting enemies closer to the top of that range?
Potentially. Yeah, so there's going to be there's a variability in terms of how you play them and how good they are. Then you'd be facing something that has the potential to be so much better than you.
Yeah, I'm not even sure how that works.
I'm not sure how that would work.
I'm picturing what
yeah, I'm just making
about.
stuff as we go along because I was thinking of this question sort of in the back of my head as we were doing it because that wasn't the part that I was thinking of. It's that, like, what actually occurred to me, the first part was that when Cameron was saying that we started doing this whole sub-maximal teams, and I think it probably wasn't true, but we might have popularized it at best because we had the platform for it. And a lot of times there is a motivation, especially when you start, right? There was such a long time period in the game where max was 40 and 5, Elite 5, that people were just busy maxing things out. And when you just had the increase, the next step was maxing everything out before people had a chance to realize, okay, so maybe this is a problem if in a world of Astro Harness, where Astro Harness really slows down the fight.
Yeah, I think it really hit when the level caps and the elite caps were being raised at the same time as a bunch of characters were being released, and then you had a million things going on, like gear, and your credits were split so many different ways, that it really made us take a step back and go, okay, where does it actually make sense to funnel resources here?
Right.
And what does it mean to, upgrade your gear? What does it mean to upgrade your characters? And just like we've been talking about with the matchmaking, right? The fact that gear don't seem to influence matchmaking at all made it a really sort of easy choice to push for gear first, because we already had from previous updates, a lot of characters pretty well maxed out. We crunched the numbers and said, okay, well, it makes a lot of sense to put more stats into gear. And then we realized after a certain point that there was really diminishing rewards for putting more resources into upgrading your elite level and your character level. And after a certain point, it didn't make things any easier. It didn't help you in any tangible way.
Yeah. All right, so let me refine the idea I was talking about earlier. So if you've got a team that's unbalanced, one really strong, two kind of weak.
Yeah.
The threat level is going to be pretty flat in terms of the range. You play it well, play it poorly. It's all about the same threat level. Mm-hmm. Okay? Then the team that you're matched up against is going to be a team that bottoms out at your threat level. And if it's played well, will have a much higher threat level
than your team.
Yeah. So that there's a range so that it bottoms out at where you are.
When you say played well, though, the AI always plays it pretty much the same way.
Well, okay, so maybe playing is the wrong word then. That it's strategized well. So it means that if you... Again, let me try to think of an example where tagging... Because tagging has a lot to do with gear.
Yeah.
So let's say, to me, a high threat level team is a character that has, say, Hawk Girl in it. Mm-hmm. And characters that have passives that rely on tagging in.
Yeah.
And so there's a huge potential. I guess the problem is really that gears are such a big part of it. And I know I said that I want gears not to count to encourage people to get gear, but I think
you almost need to.
You almost need to.
Yeah, so we're sort of even trying to figure out how we would balance this game, how we would do anything to the matchmaking.
It's not. It's
so granular, and it's so... It would be impossible to implement that. And so it makes a lot of sense why games sort of do their best approximation, but then go, I don't know. And especially, like we've mentioned before, in a game like Injustice, it doesn't matter nearly as much because there's not a person on the other side. But I can understand why matchmaking is such a huge and challenging element of any online game. Because I honestly can't even imagine the amount of numbers you'd have to crunch to try to make the maximum percentage of games feel fair and even and close. Especially in like a first-person shooter or something like that, where there's just like so many factors, where it feels like it's impossible to get any sort of read. I don't even know how they do an approximation of a good job in the first place.
Yeah. I mean, I think they've done a really good job overall, considering how long it's been around and how much I still enjoy playing it, they've done a really good job.
Mm-hmm.
It's so much better than a lot of those pay-to-win games.
Yeah.
That there's still so much playability. And if you're watching this, and I've done this properly, what you're watching is an Earth 2 Flash team that is not the one we played before, that is really kind of interesting and is pretty darn effective, surprisingly, given that it's not a full Earth 2 Flash team. It no longer is Killer Frost, but we're taking advantage of Hawkgirl.
Mm-hmm. So there we go. I think this probably brings us to the end. We've been a lot of places. I feel like this episode's been a little more scattered and there's been a lot of idea generation happening, but hopefully people can get something worthwhile out of it. But to finish up, I'd like to say some thanks to some folks. I'd like to give a shout out to Eliza. Caton. That's me yelling. This shout out was brought to you by a 2009 Shaq tweet about Knott's Berry Farm. If you haven't seen it already, you should look it up. It's pretty good.
We'll link it in the description.
Yeah. And we'd also like to give a huge thank you to all the lovely folks who supported us on Patreon.
And that would be Bumble Ben, Consul Peasant, and Edwoon at the top tier last word. Sinemac and Mohammed Albshaiti at the Your Message Here tier. Shawn, Farrell, Daniel Simonson, Aaron Maule, Michael DeVries, Brandon C., Irvin Ruiz, Eddydoo, and Hoshi 127 supporting us at the credited level. Chris Wolf, Scarlet Danny, Awesome Gamer 241, Pavu RS, Gavin Malott, and Nisfar E at the gratitude level.
Thank you so much for your support, and we'll see you next time.
Komoda.